Mirëmëngjes, të nderuar përfaqësues të Bankës Evropiane për Rindërtim dhe Zhvillim, të nderuar kolegë, miqtë e të ftuar. Në radhë të parë, më lejoni t'ju falenderoj për pjesëmarrjen në këtë prezantim të raportit të tranzicionit të Bankës Evropiane për Rindërtim dhe Zhvillim për periudhën 2022-2023. Si gjithnjë, ky raport mbetet një analizë profesionale dhe autoritare e ecurisë ekonomive në proces tranzicioni dhe konvergjencë, një pasqyrë plot e sfidave afatshkurtra dhe afatgjata me të cilat ato ekonomi përballen, si dhe një udhërrëfyes i çmuar i politikave të stabilizimit dhe zhvillimit të nevojshme për të mbështetur një progres të qëndrueshëm ekonomik dhe shoqëror. Në këtë kontekst, është kënaqësi e veçantë për Bankën e Shqipërisë ta mirëpres këtë event, i cili mbledh së bashku studiues të fushës, aktorë të rëndësishëm të sektorit publik dhe privat, si dhe përfaqësues të industrisë financiare. Jam i bindur se ky forum diskutimi do të lehtësojë shkëmbimin e ideve dhe identifikimin e masave të nevojshme për adresimin e sfidave që ne kemi përpara. Duke përfituar nga rasti, përpara se të kaloj fjalën përfaqësuesve të Bankës për Rindërtim dhe Zhvillim, për të prezantuar raportin e tranzicionit, më lejoni të ndaj me ju opinionin e Bankës Shqipërisë për disa nga temat kryesore të prekura në këtë raport tranzicioni. Kryefjala e raportit të këtij viti janë pasojat ekonomike të konfliktit ushtarak në Ukrainë, të para këto si në planin afat shkurtër dhe afat mesëm, ashtu dhe në planin afat gjatë. Ky konflikt tragjik ka shkaktuar humbje të mëdha në jetë njerëzore, gjymtime dhe pasoja afatgjata sociale, si dhe një shkundje të rendit gjeopolitik botror. Më në detaje, raporti i tranzicionit nënvizon se ne po jetojmë në një kohë të pazakont dhe për një pjesë të madhe të shoqërisë, deri para pak kohësh kjo ishte e paimagjinueshme. Në aspektin ekonomik, ky konflikt ishte një goditje e fortë oferte për thuajse të gjithë kontinentin evropian, goditje e cila u pasqyrua në rritje të shpejtë inflacionit dhe të pasigurisë, në përkeqësim të termave të tregtisë, në thellim të deficitit të llogarisë korrente dhe në shtrëngim të kushteve financiare. Në këto rrethana, brenda një harku të shkurtër kohor, pas përfundimit të emergjencës pandemisë, ekonomitë e rajonit u detyruan dhe u përballen me një sfidë tjetër madhore, sfidë e cila rrezikoi stabilitetin ekonomik dhe financiar dhe dëmtoi perspektivat e rritjes për të ardhmen ekonomike. Në mënyrë të natyrshme, ekonomia shqiptare sigurisht që nuk bëri përjashtim nga ky realitet. Pas një rimëkëmje të shpejtë dhe të plotë ekonomike gjatë vitit 2021, goditja e ofertës së huaj u transmetua direkt në kostot e prodhimit dhe në çmimet e konsumit dhe përjedhoi rritja e inflacionit u përshpejtua duke arritur në nivele të pashënuara prej disa dekadash në vendin tonë. Këto zhvillime parashtruan sfida të qëndrueshme për vendimarrësit e sektorit privat dhe publik. Për operatorët e sektorit privat, rritja e kostove dhe dëmtimi i zinxhirëve ndërkombëtar të prodhimit dhe tregtimit kërkoi një rivlerësim të përshtatshmërisë së planeve të biznesit, si dhe marrjen e masave operacionale dhe financiare për ruajtjen e qëndrueshmërisë së bilanceve të tyre. Zhvillimet e deritanishme janë inkurajuese. Sektori privat shqiptar ka vijuar të shënojë rritje të konsumit dhe të investimeve, duke gjeneruar në të njëjtën kohë rritje të punësimit dhe të pagave, rritje të produktivitetit dhe bilance të shëndosha financiare. Për vendimarrësit e sektorit publik, rritja e shpejtë dhe e gjithanshme e çmimeve parashtroi sfidën e dyfisht të zbutjes së pasojave ekonomike dhe sociale në afat shkurtër dhe të ruajtjes së stabilitetit monetar dhe financiar të vendit në afat mesëm dhe në afat gjatë. Për të arritur këto qëllime, sikundër nënvizon dhe raporti i tranzicionit, harmonizimi i politikës monetare me politikën fiskale ka qenë dhe mbetet një tipar esencial i politikave të suksesshme ekonomike. Stabiliteti afatmesëm dhe afatgjatit çmimeve ka qenë dhe mbetet objektiv prioritar i Bankës së Shqipërisë. Për këtë arsye, ne si Bankë Shqipërie nisëm më herët dhe ndoqëm në mënyrë konsekuente një proces normalizimi të qëndrimit politikës monetare. Ky proces u materializua në rritje progresive të normës bazë të interesit, në komunikim të hapur të pritjeve tona për të ardhmen, si dhe në rikonfirmimin e vazhdueshëm të vullnetit të Bankës së Shqipërisë për marrjen e të gjitha masave të nevojshme për kthimin e inflacionit në objektiv brenda një horizonti kohor të arsyeshëm dhe me kosto sa më të ulta për aktivitetin ekonomik. Këto vendime kanë qenë të udhëhequra nga analiza dhe parashikime të kujdesshme, të bazuara në informacionin më të fundit, si dhe të orientuara nga ruajtja e balancave të duhura midis rreziqeve për ekonominë e vendit. Në të njëjtën kohë, reduktimi i deficiteve buxhetore, i shfaqur në formën e frenimit të investimeve publike, ka ndihmuar në kontrollin e presioneve inflacioniste dhe ka rritur hapësirat e reagimit të politikës fiskale në të ardhmen. Paralelisht me të, subvencionimi i çmimit të shitjes me pakicë të energjisë elektrike për familjet dhe zbatimi i paketave sociale, masa këto të cilat vlerësohen rreth nivelit 2% të PBB-s, ndihmuan në zbutjen e ndikimit të goditjes në shtresat më të brishta të shoqërisë shqiptare. Politikat tona ekonomike ndihmuan në ruajtjen e një niveli relativisht të ulët të inflacionit të krahasuar me vendet e rajonit, në uljen e pasigurisë si dhe në ruajtjen e stabilitetit financiar në vend. Projekcionet tona sugjerojnë se inflacioni do të vijojë trajektoren rëndëse gjatë vitit 2023 dhe do të kthehet në objektiv brenda gjysmës së parë të vitit 2024 dhe për më tepër ekonomia shqiptare pritet vijojë të rritet gjatë kësaj periudhe, ndërsa bilancet e bizneseve dhe familjeve pritet të mbeten në tërësinë e tyre të shëndetshme. Pavarësisht kësaj tabloje, sfidat mbi ekonomitë në tranzicion mbeten ende prezente. Raporti i Tranzicionit të Bankës Evropiane për Rindërtim dhe Zhvillim me të drejtë nënvizon se konfliktet dhe tensionet politike sjellin pashmangshmërisht ndryshime të rëndësishme strukturore. Së pari, këto konflikte shoqërohen me rritje të emigracionit, me pasoja afatgjata si për vendet pritëse dhe për ato të origjinës. Si një vend me histori të pasur emigracioni, Shqipëria ka përjetuar si anët pozitive, ashtu dhe anët negative të këtij fenomeni. Nga njëra anë, ky fenomen ka gjeneruar flukse hyrëse valutore dhe rritjet përgjithshme të dijeve dhe të ekspertizës, të cilat janë të domosdoshme për zhvillimin e vendit. Nga ana tjetër, emigracioni pakson forcën e punës, sidomos në segmentet më të kualifikuara të saj dhe dëmton perspektivat afatgjata të rritjes. Për këtë arsye mendojmë se nevojitet një koordinim më i mirë në nivel ndërkombëtar për të kujdesur që përfitimet e ardhura nga emigrimi dhe lëvizja e lirë e njerëzve të ndahen në mënyrë sa më të drejtë midis vendeve të ndryshme. Së dyti, tensionet gjeopolitike pasqyrohen në rritje të proteksionizmit, fragmentarizim të zinxhirëve të prodhimit dhe orientim të flukseve të investimeve të huaja direkte drejt vendeve mike, si dhe në frenim të procesit të globalizimit. Së treti, tensionet gjeopolitike ulin vëmendjen ndaj reformave strukturore. Reformat cilat kanë qenë dhe mbeten instrumenti i vetëm për një rritje më të shpejtë e të qëndrueshme ekonomike. Sa më sipër detyra e politikbërësve në nivel kombëtar dhe ndërkombëtar është që këto sfida t'i njohin dhe të kujdesen për minimizimin e pasojave të tyre. Në veçanti, kryerja e reformave strukturore, e cila është ngadalësuar që prej nisjes së pandemisë në të gjitha vendet e rajonit, duhet të kthehet si prioritet strategjik kombëtar për të gjitha vendet në tranzicion. Ndjekja e këtyre politikave do të mundsonte si shuarjen e efekteve të mundshme negative në afatgjat, ashtu dhe nxjerrjen e disa përfitimeve ekonomike për të gjitha vendet në tranzicion. Të nderuar pjesëmarrës, duke ju falendëruar edhe një herë për pjesëmarrjen, ju ftoj që të kontriboni me diskutimet tuaja në shtjellimin e mëtejshëm të raporteve të mesazheve të raportit tranzicionit të Bankës për Rindërtim dhe Zhvillim. Ju falemderit, këto ishin komentet e Bankës Shqipërisë lidhur me raportin e tranzicionit. Fjalin dëshiroj t'ja kaloj zonjës Ekaterina Sokolova, që është drejtoresha e Bankës Evropiane për Rindërtim dhe Zhvillim për Shqipërinë. Falemderit, zonja Sokolova, fjala është për ju.
Thank you, Governor. Dear friends and partners of the EBRD, dear Governor Seiko, it is my pleasure to welcome you back to our annual presentation of Transition Report. It has become a lovely tradition to hold this event at the premises of our long-standing partner, Bank of Albania. And again, I would like to thank the Governor and his team for hosting us again today. This year, we're also lucky to have a special guest from EBRD, Christoph Denk, our Managing Director for Policy Strategy Delivery, who is no stranger to Albania, not least because he used to hold the same job as I am a few years back. So he knows this country very well, and I'm sure he will be pleased to catch up with some of you here today. Despite the increasingly challenging environment, EBRD has delivered, and because of the challenging environment, in fact, facing our countries of operations last year, EBRD has delivered record volume of new financing commitments, over 13 billion euros in 2022 across over 400 transactions and projects that we supported. Almost half, over the half of it is into the greening of the economy across all our countries of operations. We cannot speak of these results without mentioning Ukraine. I remember last year at this time, we were very uncertain and shocked by the events that were unfolding. In the very first days of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, EBRD has strongly condemned the actions and the aggression against Ukraine by Russia, and has put forward a resolution of suspension of the access to all EBRD resources by Russia and Belarus. And that resolution has been supported by a majority of the shareholders of EBRD, including Albania. We then moved swiftly to deploy 1.7 billion of euros of resources in Ukraine to support vital infrastructure, financial system, and other needs of the country in this very difficult time. EBRD would not be able to do that without strong support by its donor partners. 1 billion euros have been mobilized through grants from our partners and fellow IFIs. And I would like to thank Albania as well to be a donor in this effort. Moving to Albania, we had a very busy year as well. We extended over 150 million of new financing commitments to 16 projects across all sectors of the economy, from mining to banking to agro-business and tourism. And remarkably, 90% of all this financing was to private sector projects. And that's actually a record for Albania, where we are also heavily supporting the public infrastructure projects. But last year, most of our financing was indeed to support private sector projects. We as I mentioned, we were quite busy in all sectors of the economy, and I would like to highlight just a few milestones. We have supported one of the largest foreign direct investments in this country, in the mining sector. That was acquisition of Alprom by international strategic investor Rindërtim Group. We committed the next tranche of financing to OSHI for the important investment in the power distribution infrastructure. That's public sector infrastructure project. We've made very significant progress in the implementation of strategic infrastructure projects such as Tirana-Durrës Railway and Vlora Bypass. We saw commencement of the largest utility-scale solar plant in Karavasta by Voltalia. This is a direct result of our renewable energy auctions program with the Albanian government. And we've made progress in supporting the wind power auction plans, and are now embarking on helping Albania to explore offshore wind potential. Moreover, we have successfully launched the Tourism Sector Skills Council platform, which is designed to enable the dialogue between private sector and public vocational training institutions in Albania to address these skill gaps in this very important sector of the economy, and so on and so forth. I would like to thank everyone on this occasion for the great cooperation we've had last year, and I look forward to the even greater cooperation and bigger impact in 2023. I would like to pass the word to Christoph, who will inform us about our policy dialogue initiatives in Albania and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Ekaterina, and thank you very much, Governor, for hosting us again. It's great to be back. I've been back for the first time now since 6.5 years to Albania. And when I arrived yesterday, it was really exciting to see the bustling airport, the completely transformed city center. When I left, there were still cars on Skanderbeg Square. Now the city center has been completely transformed. And it's completely exciting also to see you, our friends and partners, and many of you I know. And it's really, really good to catch up with you and see what has happened in the meantime and where you see Albania going. And it has really been very eventful, but also difficult years for Albania and for the world. You had a big earthquake in 2019. The pandemic hit all of us. The war in Ukraine and its global implications is something we have been struggling with since. This is also basically the overall theme of our report that my colleagues Alex, Sander will present to you in a moment. But there's also been very positive news. In particular, I would warmly congratulate Albania on the commencement of the EU accession negotiations. So that's a great positive event, and you've been waiting long for that. I know that's really good that this is happening. A few words on the economic situation on the Western Balkans and on Albania. The governor talked about that, of course, as well already. Inflation has been the big topic for the region, for Albania, for the world as a whole. We hope it has peaked also in Albania towards the end of last year. What's interesting for Albania is that the level of inflation was actually lower than in most other countries in Europe. But for Albania, it has still been the highest rate in 20 years or so. And it is inflation that is very much hitting, of course, disposable incomes and particularly the most vulnerable parts of the population. So that is of course, a great concern. But I hope indeed that the peak has been passed. With that came also, of course, naturally the tightening of financial conditions that has an impact on the economy as well. For Albania, what's also, of course, very important is the slowdown in the EU economies with whom Albania is closely linked in terms of trade, investment, remittances, and so on. So that's also a factor that is weighing a bit on the economy. And we are still having a period of quite elevated uncertainty this year ahead of us from a number of factors, number of global factors that ranges from the Chinese recovery to the energy price developments that are quite important as well. So overall, we will come out with our new forecasts on the 16th of February. So the tendency is that for our assessment for 2022, for last year, we think probably the growth has been a bit stronger than we had expected, so that's good news. For this year, for 2023, it may be a little bit slower than we had expected, and that is completely in line also with what the IMF and the World Bank are forecasting for 2023. So that's sort of the big picture in terms of the economic situation. Maybe I say a few words also about where we see sort of the main drivers and contributors to growth. And first of all, the macroeconomic stability has been maintained, and I think that is not an easy feat in these times. So both in terms of monetary policy, but also in terms of fiscal policy, that was very, very appropriate. Congratulations to the authorities on that. Second is, and that is a specific Albanian factor, is that the tourism sector is growing very, very rapidly, and that's very positive. In fact, Albania was probably the country in Europe that had the strongest rebound after the COVID pandemic. So this is a very positive effect, and we will try to support that as well as EBRD. And finally, the topic of continuous structural reforms is very important, and it will be an important determinant of growth. And as the governor said, obviously during the crisis times and COVID in particular, focus was much less on that. Focus was much more on survival. And now it's very important to take that topic up again, using also the tailwinds, if I may say, from the EU accession process. Looking a bit more specifically on these structural challenges, we have a way of doing that at EBRD, where we try to assess countries and support countries on their path to sustainable market economies. And we do that by looking at sort of six elements of this sustainable market economy, and the economy should be competitive, well-governed, integrated, inclusive, and resilient and green. That is sort of how we operationalize that. In Albania in particular, we see that the topics of being well-governed and resilient is something that needs to be focused on in particular. On well-governed, the big topic is here ultimately the formalization of the economy. It's a very, very important topic that remains, and we hope again that the EU accession process will help on that path. And on the topic of resilience, I would perhaps highlight in particular resilience in the energy sector. Albania is very much dependent on hydropower, and what is very important is to diversify into other areas of renewable energy sources, and Albania is extremely well suited for that, like solar and wind, to reduce this dependency. So these are just a couple of topics on the structural side. Let me close by giving you a few examples of what we are doing as EBRD on the policy side to support Albania on this path. In the area of well-governed, we are supporting, together with our donors, the Investment Council. That is a platform for dialogue and for coming up with concrete actions to improve the business climate, together with the government and the private sector and the international partners. We are working with the state-owned enterprises, particularly also in the energy sector, with Cash and Oshi on corporate governance reforms and other areas, addressing also topics like climate risk and institutional capacity. We have, in the area of green, we have been supporting Albania on the renewable energy auctions that have been very successful and have been very much noticed in the region, and that we are mentioning and highlighting as a very successful example to others, and many investors have also taken note of that. So that has been a good success, and it's very promising for the future as well. In terms of inclusion, we have just set up in November a sector skills council for hospitality and tourism. This is where we bring together the companies in the tourism sector, as well as the government and the education providers, to ensure that there are enough skilled staff, essentially for the tourism sector. That's very important for this fast-growing industry, as I've been mentioning. So we're trying to help to develop this sector in a holistic way by financing, including for infrastructure around hospitality, but also by addressing the skills that are needed to develop that sector. And finally, we are supporting also the financial regulators and the Bank of Albania in the path to EU accession, and particularly to develop and achieve the equivalence to EU standards. So that's just a little overview of what we're doing in supporting Albania on the policy side. And with that, I hand over to my colleague, Alex Plekanov, please. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back in Tirana after a bit less than a year, and to see actually change and economic development happening. And when you see places in discrete time, it's easier to see that happening, and it is very reassuring. It's been a difficult year for all economies, and it's good to see things happening. We also, during this year, decided to look at exactly that topic in our report, Business Unusual, and to look at various disruptions to economic activity. And we have come up with quite a few, and as the work on the report progressed, there were more and more disruptions happening for us to have a look at. I will keep my presentation relatively short and focus on a few things. Maybe we'll come back to what Christoph was covering about structural reform and look a little bit more at what has happened with structural reform, but also how people perceive different areas in terms of priorities. We actually tried to look a little bit deeper into what people want from their governments and from their countries. But otherwise, we looked at economics of war and peace and what was bring in terms of economic disruption. We looked at economics of forced migration, because Europe has witnessed the largest forced displacement of people since the 1940s last year. We have looked at supply chain disruptions, and we implemented a survey in countries where we operated, and we actually went to companies and asked how they were disrupted and what they did, and we present some of those results. We also look at implications of the high levels of debt that was accumulated at exceptionally low interest rates and favorable terms, and what it means. And we look at what happened with increases in energy and food prices and how governments responded. So in terms of economics of war and peace, we tried to look at 200 years of history and what actually happened during wars. Wars between states have become somewhat less common since the 1990s, but the share of civil wars around the world has actually increased. So sadly, there remains to be quite a few points of data generated for us to have a look at. And if we look at what happened to economies during the war, there is a huge variation in experiences. In whichever measure you look at, here it's a cumulative drop or increase in GDP per capita. And in most cases, it's a very large drop. But there were also economies that used this opportunity to rebuild their structures and change institutions as economies come out of the war. So that reconstruction phase is actually also a window of opportunity that doesn't happen very often, but it does happen after the wars, and I think it's all the more important to try to seize that opportunity. We also looked at what happens to various other economic parameters, and wars do add to inflation within the countries and globally. Within the countries at war, it typically goes up by 8 percentage points, and that goes up by about 47 percentage points of GDP on average, and that takes a very long time to come down. We probably this stylized fact that surprised me probably most when we were looking at these data is that only 20% of wars are followed by 25 years or more of sustained peace. Somehow wars around the world tend to reoccur where they happened before, and that is probably the greatest challenge of post-war reconstructions, and probably the greatest reason why wars leave very long-lasting scars. And you can see these scars if you look at populations. They never recover, people leave, birth rates fall, people die during the wars, but also the same is true of capital stock that gets destroyed during wars and doesn't recover. So in some wars leave large scars, they are fairly difficult to mend, but there are some positive examples out there from which we can learn for reconstruction of Ukraine and other experiences. We also looked at post-war conflict and migration, and here the number of internationally displaced people has been growing exponentially, and now worldwide exceeded 100 million. And most of the time people think of people migrating from low-income countries to high-income countries, and certainly it's the waves of refugees to countries like Germany or Australia or United States that meet the headlines. But if you look at the data, actually 75% of internationally displaced persons are hosted by low-income and middle-income countries. Among the top of them, in proportion to local populations, are a lot of economies where European Bank for Reconstruction and Development still works, or used to work, as in Cyprus until recently. So 4 out of 4 economies, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey and Cyprus, is where we have been actively working, and there are a number of others also in Europe. And basically in this chapter, we survey experiences with integration of refugees and forced migrants. We looked at policies that governments have implemented, and we looked at what happened to Ukrainians and what may have been different this time round. And I think there are 2 differences that emerge, but probably as of August, when we did this survey, online survey of people in receiving countries and also Ukrainian refugees, the attitudes towards refugees have improved somewhat across the board relative to the historical averages. In countries like Poland, Hungary, that have been receiving large numbers, but also in countries like Germany, Sweden, United States, and so on. And you have probably also have some positive news in a way that top of the concerns of Ukrainians answering this survey was homesickness, separation from family members, and so on. The job search and language training, finding schools, healthcare, and so on were also major concerns expressed by a large majority of people, but they were not top of the list. And here, change in approach across economies of European Union, where these refugees received in various forms, but more or less a right to work in the EU and access public services for 3 years. That has been of major help. So maybe I will stop a little bit more on supply chain disruptions and what we see in the data, as Governor also covered this topic quite a bit in the opening remarks. The economies in the region where we work have become very strongly integrated in world financial and trade systems. It has been more or less an economic model for this region for the last 20 years of development. And then last year came a major disruption. And what we tried to do here is to leverage the enterprise surveys that we do with the World Bank and the European Investment Bank, where we go and every few years we survey randomly selected firms with 5 employees and more in countries where we work. And so we actually looked at firms that both export and import, and we called them up and asked to answer a short follow-up survey. And surprisingly, firms were reasonably enthusiastic, and we had 815 firms across 15 economies answering that survey. And that is about a response rate of around 55%. And for the Office of National Statistics in the UK, the response rate for these surveys is now around 40%. I don't know if you get approached with these surveys, but there are a lot of surveys, so people and companies are increasingly tired of answering them. So what did we actually learn? Well, we have a lot of companies being disrupted. The majority were disrupted by shipping issues and by suppliers outside China not delivering. Actually, relatively few firms have suppliers inside China, about 20%. But of course, these things, and about 10% were disrupted by suppliers directly located in Ukraine, Belarus, or Russia. But of course, these things also aggregate through the supply chain. You may not have suppliers in China, but your suppliers may have suppliers in China, and so on. So this actually amounted to a very large disruption. And this is the disruption that is experienced not only by large firms, but also by representative firms that we see. And actually, firms are very good at responding to this, and we have conducted this survey also in Germany, or our partners in IFO, and firms respond by increasing inventories, by sourcing the same input from more suppliers. Astonishingly, 60 to 70% of firms manage to do that in a very short period of time, taking other measures. Importantly, digitalizing paperwork and logistics management. Here, Germans were twice better than firms in our region, so it's 60 and 30%. There is still that digitalization gap, but companies do that. And in the sort of spirit of geopolitical discussions, we also tried to look how many of the firms that changed their main supplier moved the supplier from abroad to a domestic supplier. And the answer is 20%. And then we had actually a lot of discussions whether 20% is a large number or a small number. To proponents of industrial policy, it may look like a small number. You create these incentives and so on, and 1 in 5 companies actually move domestically. But if you look at it in aggregate terms, it's actually a lot of movement of production in terms of shortening supply chains and moving domestically. What we didn't ask, though, and with the benefit of hindsight we should, is how many of the firms that had a domestic supplier disrupted look for a supplier abroad. So without actually knowing the other side of this coin, it's very hard to draw a solid economic conclusion. So we also learn from our surveys and how we don't do them sometimes optimally in the first instance, but it is certainly a strong trend towards shortening of supply chain. It is something that maybe economies in the region can benefit a little bit, because when you ask companies in Germany, suppliers in Western Balkans or Turkey or Croatia, they're not viewed as reliable as German suppliers or suppliers from France, but they're viewed as a lot more reliable than suppliers not only in China, but also in Southeast Asia, in places like Thailand and Vietnam. So maybe there is a window of opportunity there for countries in the region in reconfiguration of the supply chains. And suddenly we also looked at what people are particularly worried about in the calls, and these worries about supply chains. This is, of course, nothing new. So this is data from the earning calls when equity analysts discussed with potential investors and industry analysts basically prospects for company earnings, and then people transcribe them and then analyze what people talked about. And there have been always talk about supply chain disruptions, but that has really come up to a very high extent. And actually, probably there was more talk about supply chain disruptions in general than disruptions specifically mentioning war or the gas situation in Europe. And environment has been kind of slowly increasing on people's radar, but in a much more gradual way. So we'll look at 2 other related issues. We make this hypothetical experiment. What would happen in the world if you were to split the world into 2 trading blocks that are much more keen on trading with each other than trading across this imaginary border? And this exercise took the UN vote on the 2nd of March condemning invasion of Ukraine and to the countries that voted in favor and all the other countries. And it splits the world more or less into two equal halves, because you have very large economies like US on the one side, but you also have very large economies like China, India, etc. On the other side that abstained or voted against Russia itself. If you look at it, depending on your economic structure and your ties and the assumptions you make, the cost of this split is somewhere between 0.5% of GDP and 5% of GDP. Now you would ask, is it a high cost? Is it a low cost? As with any insurance, insurance is expensive, and it depends what you want to insure and against what. I think that there are certainly elements like energy security, where people would be prepared to pay a very high price for this type of insurance, and this is what has been happening this year and last year in Europe. But there are probably other areas and industries where insurance to the tune of 5% of GDP is not worth paying. And this is the balancing act, I think, that it is very important for policymakers to keep in mind. And related to these geopolitical barriers that are growing, but this time to actually solve environmental pressure, environmental problems, is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is a new regime that the European Union will introduce from 2026, where the exemptions from the internal emissions trading system in Europe will be replaced with taxing or collecting a levy at the border from exporters to the EU in selected sectors, like plastics and steel and other energy-intensive sectors, and that will be based on the emissions in the country of origin, like Albania or Serbia, if goods are exported to the EU, and the local carbon price versus European price. The important thing here is that if emissions are not certified, so there is no good paper trail of how much energy intensity and carbon intensity went into production, then companies will be assumed to be the same as the 10% worst polluters inside the EU. And rest assured, inside the EU, in places like Romania, Poland, etc., there are still bad polluters. So this is actually a very punitive rate. And this is a change for the exporters to the EU that is coming. It's an important change. And I think one element that economies would need to solve in the coming year is the certification of exporters. Albania is a major exporter. At the moment, there is no very good paper trail for all companies of what are emissions embedded in the production. And if you were to apply this punitive rate, that would probably increase the unit cost of exports at the EU border by around 40%, 40. This is a huge impact on the competitiveness. It's not the worst. If you look at South Africa or North Macedonia, it may be even worse. South Africa actually has good certification. It just has bad coal. So even if you certify it, South African steel actually looks very bad. Same with India, etc. But this is a change that is coming, and this is something I think that economies will be increasingly paying attention to. There is a chapter about zombies. I think that's not a picture from our office, but somewhere thereabout, maybe from a neighboring office. Basically, we look at what cheap debt does to firms and subsidies, and it does reduce business dynamism, and that's probably not particularly surprising. What I think, just to show you one picture why people are actually concerned about zombie firms coming, is because companies on average actually have had a very good COVID. Somehow it was the first major economic crisis in history where bankruptcies have gone down big time. And it happened in advanced European economies, but it also happened in emerging Europe where we work, to an even much larger extent, whereas firm registrations have kept up. As one of the panelists at the launch of Tranzicionit report in London pointed out, it was much better to be a company than a person during the COVID pandemic. Among people, a lot of people who shouldn't have died, died. Among companies, a lot of companies that should have died didn't die. And so people are concerned about it, but at the moment it's kind of hard to have data and to say how much we should be concerned, but probably we shouldn't provide subsidies to firms forever. And maybe to finish, coming back to where we started with Christoph, looking at structural reforms along the 6 dimensions, and what is the big picture that we actually see. Well, one thing that we see is that before COVID, there has been actually quite a bit of convergence in terms of how countries implemented these reforms. Countries that were less advanced in terms of all these characteristics on the left-hand side, here with low scores, they introduced more change during normal times. They have been catching up with the frontier in terms of reform and development. With COVID, that has stopped. So those lines have become flat. It has become a little bit random who continued governance and reform improvements during COVID, who didn't. And in one area, namely green, it has actually turned strongly towards divergence. Countries that have already been greener have been becoming even more greener in their policies, but countries that have been dirtier have stayed dirtier. So that polarization in terms of attitudes towards the green economy has started emerging stronger and stronger. And we kind of thought about it a little bit and decided to take these world value surveys, which are surveys of individuals that were conducted in 120, 130 economies worldwide. And people go, the interviewers go around and ask questions like, would you rather have better air or would you rather have more jobs? If you just ask people, would you like more jobs, people would say yes. If you would ask people, would you like better air in Tirana, I would say yes. You would probably also say yes. But now you have to choose either more jobs or better air in Tirana. And actually, those choices are not straightforward at all. Around the world, around half the people say that they want more economic development, and around half people say that they want better environment. That has been changing over time, and there has been also more polarization. In places like Japan or Egypt or Poland, people actually are strongly pro-growth and don't care so much about environment, and that has become more so. In places like Sweden, people say that they would like to have more environment. Albania has actually come out recently exactly 50-50-ish. And it has kind of swung a little bit in the direction of people wanting better environment. An economy, actually a large economy, where people now a lot more pro-environment than they used to be, is China. Around 2/3 of people say that they would rather have some cleanup than even more economic growth. So when we plug in all those answers along the 6 dimensions, and we look at the region where we work in general, what comes very strongly is people have a strong preference for economic integration and resilience, and kind of weaker preference for green and somewhat weaker preference for inclusion. Probably the largest gap with advanced economies that people have less demand for inclusion. And if you look at the assessment of transition qualities that Christoph presented earlier, there is some correlation with that. You have much more integration reforms around the EU accession, in particular in our region, and you have a lot less by way of governance and inclusion reforms. Those are reforms that are lagging behind a bit. So there is some actually correlation between how people, links between how people respond to these surveys and what gets implemented in terms of reforms. Now, which way, causality goes, of course, you can have different stories, whether, what people actually get influences what they think, or what people think influence what they get. You can make your own judgment there. But I wanted maybe to show how Albania comes out on it, how people respond to these surveys. So among advanced economies, there is one economy where people have rather strong disregard for economic integration, measured this way. And I don't know if any guesses which economy people really don't support economic integration. It turns out to be the UK. It kind of really lines up with the Brexit vote. People don't like it. And so the way we measure it here is basically people are asked whether they would identify strongly with their village or their country, and their country or Europe or the world something bigger than their country. And to the extent that people prefer their village over the country or their country over Europe or the world, they would be anti-integration. And if people respond that they identify with their country and the world, they would be pro-integration. And it turns out that in Albania, this local identification is among the strongest in the world, despite the fact that half the country probably went to work in Italy and came back and went to work somewhere else again. People still strongly identify with their local community, but people actually very much value competitiveness, i.e. economic growth. People value economic resilience and resilience to shocks. And this is how the economy comes out. And maybe the very last kind of illustration here, we also looked at the energy and food reform protection measures that economies where we work implemented over the last year. It has been a difficult year, and indeed economies across the board, advanced economies and emerging market economies, have been implementing energy subsidies, often energy subsidies per unit of use. And here, there is virtually no difference between emerging markets and advanced economies. Everyone implemented subsidies, and as the governor said, those subsidies played an important role in protecting livelihoods of people and shielding economies against even higher rise in inflation. But where the region on average where we work stands out is the use of price controls. That has been, freezing prices has been a measure which has been very popular in the region where we work. It's a bit suboptimal because it's not a targeted measure. Petrol just runs out at petrol stations, as was the case in Hungary for a long time. Shop shelves become empty. Inflation actually comes back with vengeance eventually, but it has been a popular response. And it's also, you discuss it with people. Some people would say that this is the legacy of central planning and communism. People were very used to price controls, so a crisis comes and people try to implement price controls again. Other people will tell you that because people are so fond of price controls here, that communism took on in the first place. And you can have very philosophical discussions, but we actually see those dependencies and legacies very strongly in the data. And we analyze those energy measures and see what happens, and we try to map out our countries in the way how they implement those measures. But I will not go into those details. I very much hope that we can have a couple of questions or reactions or comments, and I very much hope that you will join us next time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for your very interesting presentation. A summary of the presentation of the transition report. Në mbyllje unë dëshiroj të falenderoj edhe një herë ekipin e Bankës Evropiane për Rindërtim dhe Zhvillim për prezantimin e raportit Tranzicionit, po jo vetëm për këtë. Më shumë dua të falenderoj Bankën Evropiane për Rindërtim dhe Zhvillim për gjithë ndihmën dhe suportin që ka dhënë rreth të parë për Shqipërinë, dhe veçanërisht për Bankën e Shqipërisë në projekte specifike që ne kemi pasur, që kanë qenë jashtëzakonisht suportuese dhe ndihmuese në rrugën tonë drejt integrimit evropian si bankë qendrore me standardet e Bashkimit Evropian. Veçanërisht unë dua të falenderoj drejtorin Managing Directorin zotin Kristof Denk për ndihmën dhe dashamirësinë që ka pasur gjithmonë për Shqipërinë. Zoti Den ka qenë drejtori i Zyrës së Shqipërisë dhe njeh realitetin shqiptar dhe është një kënaqësi e veçantë që të jetë sot prezant këtu në prezantimin e këtij raporti tranzicioni. Prezantimi i raportit mbaroi, nëse keni pyetje ose diskutime, komente, ne jemi të hapur të dëgjojmë. Faleminderit. Pas ka një pyetje, po.
Gisela Troglini nga Gazeta Si, pyetja është për përfaqësuesit e Bergji. Referuar raportit, theksohet se ndër prioritetet që duhet të ketë Shqipëria është një reformë fiskale dhe lehtësim taksash. Ku duhet të përqendrohet kjo reformë fiskale dhe për çfarë taksash bëhet fjalë të cilat duhet të lehtësohen? Faleminderit.
Thank you very much for this question. I think this topic also falls under the big theme of formalization of the economy. I think that is the big theme, and it includes also the fiscal space, very important to formalize, and also to widen the tax base in that instance. So that has been a persistent challenge for Albania for many years, and it's very important to continue on that. I think one tool to do that Albania has been using also in other spheres is to use digitalization to formalize the economy.
Pyetje tjetër.
Erblina nga BC News. Një pyetje për guvernatorin në lidhje me nivelin e inflacionit. Ju deklaruat pak më parë që gjatë këtij viti parashikohet një ngadalësim i nivelit të inflacionit për Shqipërinë për të kthyer në objektiv gjatë vitit tjetër. A mund të thoni konkretisht rreth çfarë vlere ju vlerësoni që mund të luhatet gjatë këtij viti dhe mund të kemi rritje në muajt në vijim, vlerësime normalisht?
Faleminderit. Ne jemi duke kryer analiza dhe pas nesër do të kemi mbledhjen e Këshillit Mbikëqyrës Bankës së Shqipërisë, ku do të dalim me deklaratën e politikës monetare më konkrete, por paraprakisht unë mund të them që niveli i inflacionit për te pritshmërive tona në kahun pozitiv ka rezultuar më i ulët në këto 2 muaj, pra ka filluar një rënje e nivelit të inflacionit, e cila është e konfirmuar dhe nga shifrat ekzistuese që ne kemi. Nuk ka ndryshuar parashikimi i Bankës së Shqipërisë për arritjen e objektivit të inflacionit. Targeti i Bankës së Shqipërisë është 3% dhe ne parashikojmë që do të arrihet në gjysmën e parë të vitit 2024, sikurse e theksova, inflacioni parashikohet nga analizat e politikës monetare të Bankës së Shqipërisë të vinë në rënje graduale gjatë vitit 2023 dhe të arri objektivin në gjysmën e parë të vitit 2024. Ky është parashikimi i momentit. Paralelisht, duhet të theksoj që rreziqet nuk janë kapërcyer, pra kjo nuk do të thotë që pavarësisht nga parashikimi, kjo nuk do të thotë që ne kemi kapërcyer të gjithë rreziqet që kanë të bëjnë me goditjet qoftë nga jashtë, qoftë nga brenda në raport me rritjen e çmimeve. Banka e Shqipërisë vazhdon të jetë alerte dhe sigurisht që ne vazhdojmë të mbajmë si prioritet, jo vetëm prioritetin ton ligjor që kemi stabilitetin e çmimeve me ligj, por vazhdojmë të mbajmë në fokus politikën tonë monetare, e cila mund të vazhdojë të jetë shtrënguese, gjithmonë bazuar në dhënat. Pra, mund të vazhdojë rritja e normës interesit bazuar në dhënat, por që ne do të shohim, por niveli i inflacionit fatmirësisht ka ardhur në ulje dhe Banka e Shqipërisë, si gjithmonë, është treguar e kujdesshme që me politikën e saj monetare të frenojë rritjen e inflacionit dhe nga kahu tjetër të mos dëmtojë rritjen ekonomike. Do të shohim si do të shkojnë shifrat dhe do të reagojmë me politikën tonë monetare. Parashikimi sipas pyetjes suaj është ky që ne do të parashikojmë të arrijmë objektivin e inflacionit në gjysmën e dytë e parë të vitit 2024 në nivelin prej 3%. Faleminderit. Nuk ka pyetje tjetër, një koment nëse ka një pyetje për raportin. Raporti i tranzicionit është i plot, përmbledhja u bë nga Aleksandri, nëse ju keni ndonjë pyetje. Faleminderit. There is another question about the report. If you want to say something or we're over, there is no more questions for the report.
Just to close maybe by again thanking you very much, Governor, for hosting us, by thanking all of you, our partners, our friends for being here. It's really a pleasure to be back, and we look forward to engaging with you, maybe even in the next minutes and hour as well here. Thank you so much.